We all love spy movies. That's why we do what we do. Our podcast, Cracking the Code of Spy Movies, and our website, spymovienavigator.com, are the premier go-to resources for spy movie fans. But today, we're going to do something a little different. Hi, this is Dan.
And Tom.
And today we dig into Operation Bodyguard, a real World War II operation that had a tremendous impact on the world and the world of spy movies. And we have a special guest to set the stage with us today. Behind all the spy novels written and all the spy movies produced, there is a backdrop in the real world on which all of this emerges. Real spies and real spy operations. Without real spies, we have no fiction. And sometimes real world stuff outshines even great fiction. Today, we're going to dive into Operation Bodyguard, the operation that changed the outcome of World War II with its complex plan of deception to deceive Hitler and his regime about the actual invasion site and date for D-Day, the invasion of Normandy that changed the course of World War II and the world. It was a massive deception plan with many components.
And I totally love this topic because deception is something that it's like, can you really get away with that? And so I'm really happy we're going to spend a few episodes discussing these real world espionage situations. In some cases, we'll be tying it to a movie, and others like today, it won't be tied directly to a movie. And as a reminder, we did do an episode on Operation Mincemeat, which was a deception operation. So as Dan said, Operation Bodyguard was designed for deception of the location of D-Day. Other operations were focused on deception as well. In fact, there was a group called the Ghost Army that deployed mainly after D-Day, and they used a wide variety of tricks to help the Allies win the war. And we'll talk a little bit about that here today.
All right, Tom was referencing the book, The Ghost Army of World War II, and today we have, as our special guest, historian Rick Beyer, who co-authored the book, The Ghost Army of World War II, which is a fascinating book. And Rick, you turned that into a documentary in 2013, and you also know about Operation Fortitude, one of the sub-operations of Operation Bodyguard as well. So we're going to ask Rick to join us now and set the stage for us as to the high-level details of Operation Fortitude before Tom and I dive into the meat of it all. Rick Beyer, welcome to our show, Cracking the Code of Spy Movies.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks so much for having me and giving me a chance to talk about World War II deception.
Yeah, we're looking forward to hearing it.
Well, after reading your book, I know you know how to talk about it because I totally enjoyed this book. And for me, I knew a little bit about deception happening, but I had no clue what scale it was on until I read your book here. What I really like about this book is you've got it written so it's a quick read, broken into nice chapters, and you have so much ancillary information in terms of pictures and maps and all of this stuff showing us what really happened and how these people really did these deceptions that, quite honestly, if you look at it on the face of it, looked like that can't work. And yet it was able to work. So it was really, really well done.
Well, thank you. I mean, I've worked 20 years telling the Ghost Army story. And yeah, when I started out, definitely many people would interrupt me when I started to talk about it and say, wait a minute, this is real? This isn't something you made up? This isn't a novel? It's a real thing? I said, yeah, it's a real unit that used inflatable tanks and sound effects and illusion to fool the Germans on the battlefields of Europe. And they conducted 22 different deception missions, and they, probably saved thousands of Allied lives and helped shorten the war. And that's a great story. It's not Operation Fortitude. As I always tell my audiences, they're very different stories, but it's another part of that whole giant deception picture.
So, Rick, we know that you know about Operation Fortitude. Obviously, you just mentioned it. Will you tell us about the high-level plans of Operation Fortitude and about the Ghost Army and what the high-level differences were?
Right. So Operation Fortitude was a plan developed as part of a larger deception plan called Operation Bodyguard. And Operation Fortitude was designed to convince the Germans that the invasion that they had expected in 1944 from the Allies was going to come anywhere but the place that it really came. So Operation Fortitude South made it seem like the channel crossing was going to happen at the Pas de Calais, which is where the English Channel is the narrowest. And so try to convince the Germans to build up their forces there when in fact that invasion was going to happen in Normandy. Fortitude North was designed to get the Germans convinced that we were going to attack Norway. They had, I think, hundreds of thousands of troops in Norway, basically doing nothing but defending it against the possibility of Allied attack. We didn't want them to move those troops down to France. So that was the second part of the deception. And to carry out these deceptions, they did use some dummies. They had dummy landing craft down along the English Channel where they were trying to simulate a buildup. They had dummy aircraft up in Scotland to make it seem like the air component of the British Fourth Army was gathered there. They had radio deception, where there were radio signals going out, making it seem like there were troop buildups in this area. They created a fake army group, the first U.S. Army group in part of Fortitude South, put George Patton in charge of it. He's driving around doing various inspections, and all of this is to fool the enemy. But the biggest part of Operation Fortitude was Operation Double Cross. And what had happened is that the British had turned every single German agent in Britain. In fact, one of those German agents, a guy named Garbo, that was his code name, a Spanish spy, he volunteered. He really tried hard to volunteer for the British and say, look, I can be a double agent. But because of that, turning all those agents, they were able to feed all this false information to Germany. And that is really the reason I think that the Fortitude deception succeeded. Now, you asked about the differences between Fortitude and the Ghost Army. There are a couple of differences. Operation Fortitude is a strategic deception. It's happening on a very large scale. Ghost Army is a tactical deception unit where they're going to be operating on a much smaller scale, kind of right on the battlefield. Whereas Operation Fortitude was a deception that started in 1943 and went on for months and months and months. Most Ghost Army deceptions lasted 3 to 5 days. They're very short in time period. And then two other differences. Operation Fortitude was dreamed up by the British, and while the Americans contributed, it was largely a British-run deception. The Ghost Army is an entirely American unit, completely dreamed up by American deceivers and put into action by them. And finally, you have the time difference. Most of Operation Fortitude happens before D-Day. The Ghost Army doesn't go into action until they can land in France, which is after D-Day.
But planning for the Ghost Army, though, started way before D-Day.
The planning for the
right?
Ghost Army starts in late 1943. In fact, the memo creating the unit goes out, I think it's Christmas Eve, 1943. And the really interesting part about that to me is that 5 months later, they're on a ship to England. I mean, that this time period is so fast. You have to create a unit and develop all the techniques, put them on ships and send them into action in the amount of time today that it would take to the Army to fill out a form and requisition rifles for them.
Oh, well. Now, Tom and I are going to talk about this a little later because we're going to dig into all the details here. But everyone from fiction to history thinks that the inflatable tanks were part of the deception of Operation Fortitude, but your research has brought you to a different conclusion. And we've read tons of stuff on this, and they all are saying it was part of Fortitude. But you have discovered something else.
I'm not the only one who discovered this, but I have the people that I believe. So yeah, everybody says that inflatable tanks were part of Operation Fortitude, except for the planners of that deception, who wrote about it and said we didn't want to use inflatable tanks because there were already tens of thousands of American and British tanks in England within a day's drive of the waterfront. What use are inflatables? We have real tanks in all these places. And we don't want to give away the secret because, inflatables can be dangerous. If somebody realizes it's an inflatable, it's going to completely flip the story and suddenly they're going to be on to you. And so there really weren't any inflatables used as part of Operation Fortitude, except the Ghost Army did a training exercise in May 1944. And they were to do it. The Allies moved them to a place that was within the area of the Fortitude deception. And they did 2 days of exercises using inflatable tanks, inflatable trucks, etc., to simulate divisions. And I have a feeling that those 2 days of exercises are where all those stories of inflatable tanks being part of Operation Fortitude come from. But it's just 2 days, and it's really not a big part of that deception.
Yeah. Was there any evidence that the Germans saw those inflatable tanks at all?
No evidence that they
Okay.
saw them while they were in England. I mean, keep in mind that the British also have, and the Americans, they pretty much have complete mastery of the air over Britain. there's not like 100 German reconnaissance planes flying around. There might be some approaching the coast, but they're going to come under such heavy attack that they really don't
Yeah.
have much going on in terms of aerial observation of England in May 1944.
Okay.
And one of the things, it's not just the tank itself, but how they operationalize this thing. I mean, you talk about them building fake tracks behind these tanks. So you've got the tank sitting there, but it can't just be sitting there by itself. It has to look like there were tracks that the ground was moved as it moved. So
Yeah,
I'm
you have to approach
fascinated.
it like an artist. If you're going to set up 30 inflatable tanks in a field, a Sherman tank weighs 40 tons. It's going to leave an impression in a farm field. A
Mm.
rubber dummy that weighs 90 pounds is not going to leave quite the same impression. So they had guys on bulldozers from the 406th Combat Engineers, and they painted the tank tracks. I mean, paint that wasn't, they bulldozed them into the ground. But if you miss one tank in a deception, you don't have the tank tracks going out to that one tank because you set them up at night and you somehow miss that, you would blow the whole thing. So attention to detail, I always say, is one of the keys to any form of deception.
Now, you mentioned Patton a minute ago, right? General Patton, and that he was part of the deception. Can you talk a little bit about how that worked?
So during Operation Fortitude, Patton was presented as the commander of the 1st U.S. Army Group. 1st U.S. Army Group was a fictional army group. It was located in the south eastern part of England, near to where you would want to be if you were going to cross at Pas de Calais. There was an American radio unit, the 3103rd, that was sending out the radio signals that were supposed to be from this 1st U.S. Army Group. And the idea was, hey, General Patton is somebody who the Germans know and they respect, and they're going to think that he should be in command. It's always easier to convince somebody of something they want to believe in the first place. So let's convince the Germans that Patton is going to be in command and that he's going to be crossing at the Pas de Calais. And so this is what he's doing. Now, I think the interesting thing here, so later when Patton is in France, Ghost Army does a number of deceptions for Patton's Third Army. I think they do more for them than they do for anybody else. And I think it's interesting to think about General Patton's views on deception. Now, in the movie and in some books, he's portrayed as being very impatient with the idea of deception, and he doesn't want to be a part of it. He wants to be in the field fighting, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at what the deception planners say about George Patton, Billy Harris, who was the commander of the Special Plans Branch for Omar Bradley's 12th U.S. Army Group, he said that basically that Patton was completely wide open, that he would do anything you asked him to in the interest of the overall picture. He was one of the most cooperative senior officers that they dealt with. That is so opposite of the Patton of legend, of the Patton who's storming around with his, pearl-handled pistols, etc. And but they said, he wanted to win. He knew deception was a way to win, and so he embraced it.
That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah, because you hear all these different things, but Patton basically, like you're saying, he wanted to win, and he was going to do whatever he had to do to help win.
Exactly.
Which is fantastic. Well, you hear a lot of different opinions on Patton, but this is good. This clears up a lot of stuff. Hey, Rick, for us, we dive into spy movies all the time. That's what we do. We see a lot of connections between these real life operations and what happens in spy movies. Deception playing a big part of that. What are your thoughts on that in terms of the spy movies you've seen and what you know of the history of?
Well, I'll tell you what I think is interesting. You may have heard of a spy named James Bond, right? You've probably done a couple of shows about him. And I remember reading the James Bond novels and seeing those movies in the 60s and 70s. And the name Ian Fleming, oh, he was an author. He wrote that stuff. Oh, that's okay. He'd been in the British Navy, whatever. Well, it turns out, as I've done a lot of research into deception and various things in World War II, that Ian Fleming was in up to his neck in spy stuff in World War II. He was involved in trying to snag an Enigma machine during the Dieppe raid. He's involved in, I just was reading a book this week that he is involved in this case of a British officer, Frederick Jutland, who's a spy for Japan against America. And so, I mean, I think that what that tells me is that a lot of spy novels and spy movies come from people who were involved in spying. I mean, Jean le Carré was involved in spying, Ian Fleming was involved in spying. And so even the fictional stories do seem to be based in truth and reality. And then you get the stories like Argo, which is a entirely true story. So I think fiction and truth start to blend in the spy movies, but I think so many of them have a sense of reality because they come from people, whether it's Fleming or Le Carré or whoever it is, who really have that basis in that spy world.
Yeah. Even Harry Saltzman, one of the co-producers of the first 11 James Bond movies, was in the intelligence community for a while. Oh, there
Yeah,
you go.
and so many times these guys don't want to tell you, right? They don't want to mention what their
Yes.
background is. They're writing all this stuff, but they're kind of keeping quiet because maybe they're under orders to do that, or maybe that there's some other reason. But you find out years later that they were involved, and you're like, oh, okay, that explains a lot.
Yeah. Certainly Fleming. He was very involved in lots of operations in World War II and brought a lot of that. And I remember they interviewing him. They said, "Could you get all of this from what you actually really did?" He said, I would be prosecuted
Yeah,
for something," he
exactly.
said, if I actually
I
told him what
can't
we
tell
really
you,
did.
but read my novels and see what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
So, are there any movies that you've seen depict deception that just totally get it wrong?
Wow. No, no. I've read movie scripts that have done that. So there
Okay.
were, over the years, a number of people have tried to make a movie out of the Ghost Army, and I've read some of those scripts, and some of them make me howl. In one of them, the Ghost Army soldiers end up putting on German uniforms, and to fool the Germans, they pretend to be a German unit. I'm like, no, I don't think that's going to happen. There's another one where they accidentally fill a tank with helium instead of air, and so it starts floating over the battlefield. I think there is a factor in deception that sometimes there's humor involved, and there certainly is humor in the Ghost Army story. And sometimes people have a hard time when they're writing a film screenplay or creating a film in figuring out the right balance of humor with the real story, because the humor is real. It's real to the story, but in terms of the Ghost Army, I mean, people died, people were killed, people were
Yeah.
badly wounded carrying out these deceptions. And so, you can go for a little bit of humor in there, but don't go too far because these are American soldiers who gave their lives to do this. I can't think of any other movie. I'm sure that when we're done, I'll think of three and I'll send you an email, but I can't think of any other movie that really gets deception wrong. I mean, I suppose you could go back to, something like The Dirty Dozen, or there was a TV show, Garrison's Gorillas in the 60s. Those might kind of blow it out a little bit, but I think in general, deception is such an odd topic that when it's approached, people, as I say, they may be going too far with the humor, they may go too far in some directions, but they're trying to be real.
All right. Hey, thanks, Rick. We're going to have you back to discuss your book, The Ghost Army of World War II.
Thank you.
And we appreciate you spending some time with us today to explain this top level detail on the Operation Fortitude and the whole deception plan with the Ghost Army. Fantastic stuff. So Tom and I are going to dive into all these little details now, but we really appreciate you spending time with us today.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
All right. We thank Rick again. That was fun. We're going to have him back on the show to talk about his book. All right. Let's get into the operation.
Yeah, now there were many, many operations in World War II.
Yes.
And so as we go through this, we're going to try to be clear as to which one we're talking about, because it can get confusing if not. So I may
Yes.
jump in a couple times just to kind of make sure, hey, we're talking about X, and,
Yeah.
and you know what it is.
Right. Of course, D-Day was Operation Overlord, but what we are talking about today is part of the plan, and this was a plan to confuse Hitler and the Germans by putting out false signals that the invasion would come later and perhaps in several possible locations at once, including Pas-de-Calais, the Balkans, southern France, even Norway. For about a year, the Allies were planning the invasion of Europe to drive back and defeat Hitler's Germany. This invasion was the key to turning the war around in favor of the Allies and defeating Germany. And Hitler knew it was coming at some unknown time an unknown destination.
Got to keep them guessing. And that's what Operation Bodyguard was born for. It was spies, code breakers, double agents, deceptive messages, and it was run by the London Controlling Section and involved other operations. Operation Bodyguard is the high level thing. They broke it into sub operations like Fortitude, and they even had them Fortitude North and South, as Rick talked about here.
Yeah, and this was a British operation, as Rick also said. The amount of strategy, deception, spying, false information disseminated, and tactical execution behind Operation Bodyguard is mind boggling. This was led by Ty Robertson in a sub operation called Operation Fortitude. The name Bodyguard came from something Winston Churchill had said to Joseph Stalin at the Tehran Conference. Quote, in wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies.
Okay, so let me try to clarify these operations then. So, as Dan said, Operation Overlord was the actual Allied invasion at Normandy. But what we're going to focus on today is Operation Bodyguard, which was again a overarching campaign with many pieces in it to try to help make Operation Overlord successful. And so the main goal here was to try to convince the German forces that they needed to be stretched across the 1,500 miles of coastline and concentrate in areas other than Normandy. So an Operation Fortitude was that sub operation to make them believe that either Pas-de-Calais or Norway would be the places the Allied invasion came in.
Operation Bodyguard is intricate and detailed and involves many double agent spies. Rick mentioned that a lot of the German spies in England were turned by England into double agents, the double cross program that we're talking about. Now, some of these spies were awarded medals, not just from the Allies. They were so good they were awarded medals by Germany as well. That's how good they were at fooling Germany. Some of these spies are now famous spies. Let's talk more about Operation Fortitude. To begin, the Allies had to convince Hitler that the Allied invasion of France would happen in a location other than Normandy, because the Allies absolutely needed Germany to have less armament and troops at Normandy and to feel the need to deploy the tanks and guns and troops elsewhere, where they thought the invasion would take place. This was critical to the success of D-Day, and the truth of the real location must never be disclosed to Germany, not even a couple of days before, as then they could move armament and troops to Normandy. To have an operation of this magnitude, the invasion of Normandy, with thousands of ships and troops, and to keep this an absolute secret, was enormous in every way.
Yeah, that keeping it secret just blows
Yeah.
my mind because so
Unreal.
many people had to know what was really going on here. Now, they chose Pas-de-Calais because that's where Hitler thought they were going to come over because it was the shortest crossing point. And so, as Rick said, it's easy to convince someone in something they already believe. And so
Or they
they were
want to
going to
believe.
make
Yeah.
Hitler believe that he was right.
Yeah.
Pas-de-Calais was going to be that invasion site. We, of course, know that's not where it was, but they needed a ruse.
Yeah. The Allies knew that the Germans were masters at intercepting radio communications and used that to their advantage.
Right. So now, in one sub operation, which was Operation Fortitude North, two spies called Mutt and Jeff,
Yeah.
with the help of radio chatter about cold weather problems with things like, ski bindings and keeping trucks running in sub zero temperatures, just basic stuff that may come over the radio in these things. They had to convince the Germans that the invasion was going to come into Norway.
Yeah.
So they wanted to keep those troops up there. And so they used fake radio chatter like this. And throughout all of these deceptions, radio chatter was really important because we knew the Germans were listening.
Yeah. The basis of the operation was misinformation. The Allies must deliver credible misinformation to the Germans. Credible misinformation to the Germans. And to do this, they incorporated a number of now famous spies who were double agents working for the UK and the Allies, but also working for Germany as trusted spies for them. This alone is what makes spy movies take a backseat to this real world stuff. These were real double agents trusted by Germany because of a complex web of deceit. Unbelievable.
And most of these spies were turned, as Rick said, there's one we're going to talk about, Garbo. who wanted to join the forces here. But the Allied forces captured these spies and told them, you're going to turn and you're going to do it right, or you're going to die. And
Yeah, there's your
fairly,
choice.
yeah, here's your choice. Go against your country, stay alive.
Yeah. These top double agent spies, most trusted by Hitler, were going to disseminate false information to the Germans. The trick is it must be credible. As we were trying to point out, we just did an episode on the 1952 movie Five Fingers, starring James Mason. It was based on a true story of this British valet who was selling top secret information to the enemy. His information had to be tested to make sure it was good, right? See if it was true. And if it was credible, the enemy then knew a lot of real information. So here in Operation Bodyguard, it has also to be credible information, or the spies would easily be found out. Now, several double agent spies helped Operation Bodyguard. They were part of the Double Cross Division of London Controlling Section. All right, let's look at the first double agent spy, whose code name was Treasure. Her real name was Natalie Sergueiew. I think I'm saying that wrong. Sergueiew. And she had direct links with the German intelligence officer. She was in charge of convincing the Germans that a large invasion force was being assembled at Kent. So she put out messages to the Germans that this was what she thought was going to be happening. Now, you have to remember, behind all of this, the Allies had already cracked the German code, the Enigma code. So they knew when they were intercepting German messages what the Germans were saying, really, and if this was really working. So that's the background of what's going on here. So to pull this off, all the Allies built inflatable planes and, like we were saying, Rick was mentioning, and tanks, but that was part of the Ghost Army, not actually part of this operation. So part of this deception at Kent was that Patton was there. Now, Rick had mentioned that Patton was very cooperative in this. And the Germans knew that, hey, if Patton's in Kent, the invasion is not going to be in Normandy because Patton would be involved. So part of Treasure's deception plan was to convince them that, hey, Patton was there in Kent, a large buildup of troops in Kent. So there you go, figure it out. So Treasure looked like a real treasure to the Germans because now she's telling them information where they could validate whether Patton was there or not. And now they're thinking, okay, she's given us some good information. Brilliantly, they had Patton in charge there. This was a deception. The most famous double agents of all of these, though, and Rick mentioned, was Garbo. Now, the Germans had a code name for him too. It was Arabelle, but we called him Garbo. The Allies called him Garbo. Garbo convinced the Germans he had high-level links to British intelligence. Now, Rick mentioned also that, hey, this guy Garbo went to the British first and wanted to spy for them, and they said, no, we're not interested in you. Then he went to the Germans and said, I want to spy for you. And they said, yeah, okay. So he's spying for the Germans. Now he goes back to the British and said, hey, I got all these contacts in Germany. Oh, now do you want me to spy for you? And they, yeah, oh yeah, okay, yeah, spy for us.
Okay, so is he smart or is he nuts?
Hey, you know, you're a spy doing this kind of stuff, double agent. You got to be both.
You gotta have brass, man.
So he created this network in England of, I think it's 23 to 27 sub agents, all sending wireless messages about the buildup in Kent. Now, he's building this network. He's got an actual map with these pins and stuff in it, and telling the Germans, here's where I got somebody in London. I got somebody north of London. I got somebody in the West. I got somebody here. It was all fake. Oh, none of these agents were real, these sub agents. It
The
was
art
all
of
a made up
deception.
network. And actually, at one point, he got funding from the Germans to pay these guys. It's like, this was fantastic stuff. None of these sub agents were real. Code breakers were monitoring the German responses, and because Garbo got some of the German codes and they cracked some of the German codes with the Enigma, they could see that the Germans were passing along the double agent messages as the truth. The Germans thought there was a big buildup in Calais and in Kent. Fantastic.
And again, it's a second one of these turned spies because he was there in part to convince the Germans, again, that it wasn't Normandy, it was going to be Pas de Calais. And so you've got these trusted agents, multiple that, from the Germans' perspective, that are giving them this false information, helping encourage the way we needed things to go.
Yeah, I love his code name of Garbo as the double agent from the Allied side, because they thought he was the greatest actor among all the agents, and they named him after the actress Greta Garbo, who was, the best actress at the time. So she was a Swedish American actress who was one of the most famous and glamorous popular motion picture stars in the 20s and 30s. So the Germans, his code name for the Germans was Arabella, as we said. That's how sure they were of him. Garbo was key to Operation Bodyguard and Operation Fortitude.
Yeah, you can check out the documentary Garbo the Spy from 2009 if you want to know more about Garbo. It's an interesting look at
It's good.
this amazing character or person.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there was misinformation, there were half-truths. Sometimes
Half-truths.
the truth was getting to the Germans a little too late, delayed
Yeah.
intentionally. I mean, it was
Yeah.
brilliant. Even the Allies didn't know Garbo's real name until long after the war,
Yeah.
because he survived, he lived a long life. His real name is Juan Pujol Garcia. So how good was Garbo? He received a message 10 days after D-Day from Germany saying he was to receive the Iron Cross for his contributions. That's how good this guy was.
Yeah.
And at the time, there were 250,000 Germans and equipment being held back in Calais. I mean, just absolutely crazy.
Yeah. He actually went to London 40 years after D-Day to receive a membership in the Order of the British Empire. He was the greatest double agent spy of the war, everyone says.
So he got
Fantastic.
an Iron Cross and an OBE. You gotta love it.
Yeah. Now there was another double agent, Brutus, and his code name from the German side was Hubert, but his real name was Roman Garby Zernewski. He also promoted the buildup at Kent. Somehow he was betrayed and captured by the Germans, so he got a choice to spy on England or see his agents die. So now it gets complicated. He already was a double agent. Now he takes on the role of spying on England basically as a triple agent now. Like, oh my God. And Berlin believed Brutus's reports.
How do you keep that all straight if you're that agent, right?
Never
I'm
making
this
a
guy
mistake,
here, but
right?
then here just, oh man, you got to be smart.
Yeah.
Yeah, another one of these spies was codenamed Bronx.
Yeah.
And her German code name was Dorette. And this woman, whose real name was Elvira Chaudoir, is close to James Bond, as she was a gambler and a card player. Just really, really cool. The Germans recruited her to spy on England, mix with the top brass in England, and then report back her findings. And she actually sent messages by post with secret ink written over the regular correspondence.
Invisible ink. How about that?
Invisible ink over real ink. And so she was instrumental in getting Germany to stop moving tanks to Normandy, which they had started to do by sending secret code messages with false information. And yes, in part because of her, the moving of the tanks to Normandy was canceled.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yep.
All right, another one of the big double agents was Tricycle, German code name Ivan Duskov Popov. We may have heard of him.
Yeah,
oh
maybe.
My God. One of the most famous spies in this operation as well. He was fantastic.
Why'd they call him Tricycle?
One reason why they may have called him Tricycle Tom is that he ran 3 double agents. He also was a womanizer and often was involved with 2 women. Or he was a triple agent, as he reported also to the Yugoslav intelligence services. This is complicated stuff, right?
So Tricycle, because he had 3 wheels spinning.
Yeah, he's got things going all the time. Well, we all know lots of talk surrounds Duskov Popov as a model for Ian Fleming's James Bond. He was a gambler, a drinker, a womanizer, and knew Ian Fleming and gambled with him, actually. Popov had very dangerous missions as he had direct personal contact with the enemy. Lisbon was the hotbed of spies in World War II because it was a neutral country. So Popov often had to deliver firsthand information to the enemy in and around Lisbon. Now, it is said that he also met Fleming in Estoril, Portugal, at the Hotel Palacio. Tom and I stayed there once. We even had martinis in the bar where lots of spies would meet, including Popov and Fleming. They both gambled at the casino next door, and this was the genesis of the Casino Royale story Fleming would later write in 1953. Very
that was really a cool place. I mean, it was really great in art. I mean, it was a nice place, but the historical significance made it that much more special.
Yes.
And Speaking of Fleming and deception, we always wonder why James Bond uses his real name in all the movies and the novels. Here we're talking about these agents and their code names. Well, if you look at a 1952 draft of Casino Royale by Fleming, it reveals that James Bond's alternate cover name was to be James Secretan. Dan and I looked at drafts of the manuscripts, and this wasn't in the draft that we examined at the Lilly Library at Indiana University. But in an article by Susanna Lazarus on April 15th of 2013, she quotes Fleming's niece as saying, Ian must have realized it would have caused confusion if he had Bond known as Bond to his friends and security services in London, but as Secretan for his cover name to strangers or people he didn't want to know he was a spy. She just thought that was going to be too confusing.
Yeah.
So we always wondered that, and now we know. Of course, it makes no sense in real life. I mean, even Mathis, his friend, that was a cover name for Mathis.
Yeah,
so
I know.
These cover
Well,
names are pretty important.
Yeah. All right, back to Popov. Popov actually met with a spy called Jebsen in Lützen many times, as Jebsen was deep in the German war machine and could provide great intel. Popov was one of the best double agent spies in the war and had in-person regular contact with the counterspies from Germany, feeding information directly to the agents. Popov even warned the head of the U.S. CIA, J. Edgar Hoover, about Japan's plan to attack Pearl Harbor a couple of months before, because he put the pieces together as to why the Japanese were interested in how successful attacks were off carriers in the Mediterranean, and also had an interest in the American harbor, Pearl Harbor. Edgar ignored him.
Oops.
Yeah.
Now, another one of these agents with the Allied code name of Artist, and this was Jepsen. Jepsen knew a lot of the German spies in England and was talking about them. The problem was that many of these spies were already turned and working for Robertson under Operation Bodyguard. Jepsen knew a lot of the details about D-Day and its secrets, and the Gestapo was closing in on him. The British knew this because of their code breaking. So the dilemma was that Robertson couldn't extract Jepsen because then the Germans would know they'd broken their code.
Couldn't do that.
If you remember the movie The Imitation Game about the cracking of the Enigma machine, one of the big dilemmas was, once the code was broken, what information do you act on without spilling the fact that you broke the code? Right? And it's the same thing here. What do you do in that situation? So if Robertson leaves Artist to his fate, the Germans might arrest him. Then once in their hands, how long before he would crack, if he did crack, and expose the real D-Day plans and all of the deception?
Yeah, these were real issues with the double agents and all of these questions that surround them like that. Treasure had threatened once to expose the plans, actually, for one reason or another, but never did.
Yeah, so now another thing, when we're talking about deception here, is Johnny Jepsen was told by the Germans that he was going to receive a medal by the Third Reich, but instead he was ambushed and drugged and smuggled out of Portugal through France and then to Berlin, where he was interrogated.
Yeah.
The Germans were very rough, and it got back to Robertson that Jepsen disappeared.
Yeah, the code breakers were now scanning hundreds and hundreds of signals, looking for information on whether the Germans now really knew the truth about the D-Day plans, because now Jepsen is in their hands. The other agents were busy flooding Germany with Calais invasion information and Kent and so on. Again, this was called Operation Fortitude. They had a north and south, as we mentioned, to deceive the Germans into deploying troops in places where things would not happen, both north and south, but not Normandy. In the meantime, Hitler met with Japan and told them that there would be an invasion soon. He knew that, of course. The Japanese wrote up their report, which Robertson saw 2 days later. Target, Calais.
Mission accomplished.
For weeks.
Deception accomplished.
For weeks leading up to the invasion, the Allies stepped up their aerial attacks on Pas-de-Calais to reinforce to the Germans that this was going to be the invasion target. Now, let's look at how far this deception went. They employed Lieutenant M.E. Clifton James, an Australian actor who bore a remarkable resemblance to General Bernard Montgomery. So,
yeah, and if you look at these guys' pictures side by side, you
yeah,
could totally believe that he could deceive people, that he was Montgomery. It was an uncanny resemblance.
Yeah, he was to impersonate the British general, and he was trained on how Montgomery moved and walked, and then was sent to Africa knowing that the Germans would know he was there and then think, hey, no invasion is going to be taking place without this general being part of it. This is brilliant stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So now, Dan, there's these double agents involved in this deception operation. What happened to these guys? We know that Jepson kind of disappeared, but what happened to these agents?
Yeah, all the double agents survived, except no one ever knew what happened to Jepson for sure. But because Hitler did not know the D-Day plans, they think that maybe he never cracked. It was reported, though, that he was shot to death, quote, trying to escape,
Oh,
which
that
was
old trope.
yeah, which was what the Germans said when they executed you. So Jepson never talked, it seemed, but he did die at the hands of the Germans. D-Day took place on June 6, 1944, and though the Allies lost 10,000 troops, many more would have died. But I can tell you, Tom, you and I stood on Omaha Beach in Normandy with a guide a few years back, and it sends chills down your spine to see how tranquil and peaceful it was now, but what the Allies went through to take that and the other beaches.
I totally agree with you here. And like you said to Rick, every American should go to
Yes.
Normandy and stand on that beach. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't really know the right words here. Maybe awe-inspiring. I'm not, that's not even quite right for me. But it was
I'm
just,
getting chills now.
yeah, amazing to stand there on the beach. You walk out on the beach at low tide. You look up at the German resistance nests. You could see where they were firing up on the Allies during the invasion. Plus, if you've seen the movie like Saving Private Ryan or The Longest Day, it even hit home more. I mean, Dan, you and I first stood in the bunker where the Germans first spotted the thousands of ships and reported it.
Yeah.
We know
that
from our
was-
guide that the Germans had enough guns to rain down 50,000 rounds a minute on the
Unreal.
Allies. I mean, think about the amount of ordnance they had there. I mean, it's just absolutely chilling.
Yeah.
So, if another 250,000 troops and equipment and armament had been moved to Normandy by the Germans because the deception failed, I mean, just think about what the impact that would have been.
Yeah. Horrible. Horrible. But thanks to these double agents, Normandy was successful and the beginning of the end for Germany. There were a bunch of other double agent spies as well, called Tate, which his real name was Wolf Schmidt. Another one codenamed Celery. He was Walter Dicketts. And there were others as well, like Mutt and Jeff that we mentioned.
All right, so Dan, we've talked about these real agents, and we talked a little bit with Rick about spy movies and deceptions. So let's go ahead now and talk about how this whole deception concept has worked its way into spy movies.
Yeah. I think probably the deepest impact was on Mission Impossible, both the TV series, really, and all of the movies. The masks, every mission was a deception and built around deception. That was the beauty of the Mission Impossible TV show, and they brought that into the movies as well. So I think that had a tremendous impact on Mission Impossible. The real stuff in the World War II now impacting Mission Impossible stuff.
Yeah, no, I agree that that was important there, but I think the deepest deception to me of the movies that I've seen is Operation Mincemeat, because that was really all about a specific deception operation.
A real one.
Yeah, the one it had that same name, Operation Mincemeat.
Yeah.
And the amount of planning for that mission was astounding.
Yeah.
Now, they ruined the movie, in my opinion, by putting in a non-real romance, but the whole deception plot, which is what this thing was,
Yeah.
was based on the real operation. And they got a lot of the operational stuff correct.
Yeah. And that's the key. Some of the other examples that we could think of on the top of your head. I mean, You Only Live Twice, of course, with Commander Bond being murdered. 3 Days of the Condor. The entire story is deception. Secret Invasion, The Spy Who Loved Me, Mr. Sterling and to Stromberg. He was Mr. Sterling. From Russia with Love, they were Mr. and Mrs. David Somerset. Diamonds Are Forever, he's Peter Franks, Oceans, all the Oceans movies, although they're not mostly heist movies. For Your Eyes Only, layers of deception in trying to retrieve the ATAC. There's tons.
Yeah, now don't forget about the trio of the seagull and Goldfinger's pre-title sequence.
That's true.
The crocodile, or was it an alligator? I don't remember. In Octopussy, or what was my favorite deception in the whole Bond series, Bond's manta ray suit in License to Kill.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Those are low levels of deception, but yeah, absolutely, all of that is in there.
Yep.
London just finished up an exhibit, Spies, Lies, and Deceptions. It ran till April 2024, where they explored the tricks, tools, and elaborate plots that make up the secret world of spying and deception. So there's a lot of interest in deception and how it's worked its way into spy movies.
So to wrap this all up, real spy stuff absolutely includes deception, and almost every military operation has a deceptive element to it. So today we talked about Operation Bodyguard and its sub-operation, Operation Fortitude. There were many more deceptive operations, all of them required to help win the war.
Hey, if you think about it, just about every spy movie we see has some element of deception in it. Of course, a spy is a person pretending to be someone else, and not a spy, obviously. They're pretending to be a different person. The events, the deceptive messages, disguises, and more. All of that is in virtually every spy movie. All right, we want to thank Rick Beyer for helping us introduce this episode. We will get him back to have a talk about his book, The Ghost Army of World War II. All right, this has been Dan
And Tom.
of SpyMovieNavigator.com and our show, Cracking the Code of Spy Movies. Please subscribe to our show right now so that you don't forget. Thanks for spending time with us. We appreciate it. Thanks.